Last year, in the spirit of Halloween, I did a top 10 list covering the things that scared me as a kid. And personally, it's one of my favorite videos I've ever made. Mainly because I got to reminisce on nostalgic moments from my childhood. So I wanted to do another video on nostalgic moments, but I knew that it wouldn't be another list on things that scared me because I can't really think of any other things. I did add some stuff to my mistakes video, but that's really it, so I don't have another one of those. So I decided to create this video on the top 10 things that made me cry when I was a kid. Not stuff that made you cry, so don't be surprised if you don't see anything that got you misty-eyed as a kid. Or now. This is stuff that made me cry when I was a kid, not now. This video is going to focus on forms of media like video games, movies, books, etc. that made me cry, so no bullying stories or anything like that. And none of this stuff really gets to me anymore. Some moments are still sad, but nothing on here makes me break down like when I was younger. And I won't have any honorable mentions for this list because I could barely think of 10 things, but I'll add anything that comes to mind in the comments later. With that long-winded intro out of the way, let's get started. So, I've never really been into comic books. I always liked superheroes, but I would tend to lean more towards the cartoons, movies, and video games. I never thought there was anything wrong with the comic books, they just never kept my interest. I did read a couple like Secret Wars, but I always found comics to be kind of boring when I was younger. But one comic that will forever be in my mind is Silver Surfer issue number 55. One day, I saw this comic book on the floor of my brother's room, so I picked it up and was going to read it, but I couldn't even get past the first page. I think you can see why this scared me, but not in a freak me out kind of way, more in a brought me to tears because all of my favorite superheroes and villains, because Galactus is there for some reason, are dead. And their deaths are shown in graphic detail, like, Jesus Christ, look at Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. This stuff is intense. So of course I threw the book down and didn't read it until many years later. In fact, this comic book made me absolutely hate Thanos as a kid. Of course my reasoning wasn't the best because I was a kid who saw one page of a comic book he starred in. But I remember when I would play pretend with my brothers, I would make Thanos look weak. Pretty pathetic, but I was a kid. But when researching for this video, I actually thought I was reading Infinity Gauntlet when I was younger, but it was actually a crossover of sorts, even though Silver Surfer was in Infinity Gauntlet, but whatever. Point is, these deaths made me really sad. Yep, SpongeBob is actually making another appearance on one of these nostalgia lists. Which is weird because I don't think SpongeBob is known for making people scared, and I've definitely never heard of it making people cry, except for the first movie. But there were a couple episodes that got to me as a kid. But the one that literally made me cry was the episode Hooky. A lot of this episode is pretty funny with Patrick acting like an idiot, and it also has some very memorable moments. But what made me cry, well, it wasn't a sudden scene that made me burst into tears. The sadness inside built up, I guess. And it all started with the scene where SpongeBob gets hooked. The way SpongeBob acted kind of freaked me out, but what made me cry was when he got to the Krusty Krab and Mr. Krabs put up the Help Wanted sign. Then SpongeBob starts frantically apologizing as he's getting whisked away. I remember starting to cry and also getting angry because I couldn't believe Pearl and her friends were laughing. But of course SpongeBob didn't end up dying, it was just Squidward the entire time, cartoon logic for you. So it didn't make me cry for long because the scene didn't last that long, but still a sad moment. I watched a lot of Pokemon as a kid, and everyone who has knows that there are some sad moments. But for me, I didn't see the iconic sad episode Bye Bye Butterfree as a kid. If I did, then it probably would have made the list. But there were quite a few other episodes that made me emotional. Two that come to mind are the Pikachu Goodbye episode and Lucario's death and Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. But the one that hit me the hardest was Charizard's burning ambitions. I don't see a lot of people bring this one up. Essentially, Charizard stays at Charizard Valley to train with the much stronger Charizards. But when Charizard and Ash are actually saying goodbye, or Ash is just kinda leaving Charizard, is what really teared me up. Ash and Charizard had been through so much that it really hurt to see them split up. One of my favorite episodes before this point in the series was when Charizard froze so Ash helped him get better, showing how much he really cared. So seeing them split up really hurt. Of course, Charizard would come back a handful of times, but I didn't know that at the time. All I saw was Ash say goodbye to one of my favorite Pokemon he had. This is by far the earliest moment that made me cry that I can remember at least. Everyone has at least one show that was a big part of their early years. I had a couple, but Blue's Clues was my favorite. And looking back, one of my favorite things about it was Steve. I'm sure a lot of you know where this is going. He was just so enthusiastic and always made each episode a lot more entertaining for me. But then came the episode Steve Goes to College. Luckily, this episode isn't overly depressing. If it was, then it'd probably be much higher. Instead, all the characters just accept the fact that Steve is leaving. The episode kept its happy tone and fun songs, it just had a different ending. An ending that I still remember where I was when I saw it. It had Joe, who I never watched much of, but didn't think he was bad. Blue and the other characters saying goodbye to Steve. He just walked out the door and headed into the bus with everyone looking through the window. I remember looking out the closest window after seeing that and starting to think about when I was going to leave. I was like 4 at the time, so this obviously got to me. So not only did I lose one of my favorite characters in a show that I watch, it also made me think about the inevitable future. If you saw my scariest nostalgic moments list, then you'd know that a Courage made it on that one too. I'm not going to spoil it in case some of you want to watch that video after this one, but what's crazy is that the same night I saw the episode that scared me the most, I also saw the episode that made me cry. Remembrance of Courage Past. This episode sees Courage having flashbacks to when he was with his parents. He ended up being kidnapped by the same scientists that kidnapped Courage's parents and him back when he was younger. Crazy moments ensue and they eventually escape. But what got me crying was the ending where it showed what happened to Courage's parents. The music that played and Courage crying really got to me, but Muriel stumbling across Courage is a beautiful moment. Luckily, it is shown that Courage's parents get revenge, which is very satisfying. Like I said before, I didn't read a whole lot of comics. I only read the Silver Surfer comics, Secret Wars, a couple of Spider-Man comics, and the one I'm about to talk about right now. I just find it weird that 2 slots on this list are devoted to comics even though I never really read them, but that's how it is, I guess. Number 5 on the list is actually going to go to a DC comic rather than a Marvel one. When I was growing up, I preferred Marvel over DC. Sure, Batman was cool and he had some pretty awesome villains, and I grew up watching the first Superman movie, but if I had a choice on whether to watch / play a game / read a comic about a Marvel or DC character, I tended to go with Marvel. I guess the reason is because I liked the Marvel heroes more, but I don't really know. But like I just said, I grew up watching the first Superman movie. I had it on VHS and would watch it all the time, so my relatives got me Superman themed gifts every once in a while since I kind of got obsessed. With one of those being the comic Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. That is an awesome title. Now, I haven't read this comic in forever, and I also don't want to get involved with the enormous amount of information regarding the DC lore, so I'm going to tell you how I interpreted the ending of the book and what exactly about it made me cry, since this ending has been interpreted in many different ways over the years. Plus, spoilers for a 30-year-old comic book. So this book was pretty grim and not something that my mom probably would have wanted me reading at age 8 or whatever. Crypto dies, a couple other heroes die, and Lex Luthor says, "Damn." Yeah, I knew I was in some pretty crazy stuff when I read that line. And another thing that happened is Superman killed. I am not gonna read that. But it's still crazy that he killed someone. But what actually made me cry was this panel. As he walked into the blinding golden light, he turned and looked back over his shoulder. He smiled at me. I never saw Superman again. So for the people who live under a rock, kryptonite kills Superman. Or well, there are different kinds that have different effects on him, but kryptonite is his weakness, I should have said. This gold kryptonite took away his powers. They discovered a hidden passageway leading out of the fortress, and it was finally concluded that he'd walk out powerless into the sub-zero wastes to freeze. They never found his body. More coffee, Tim? Yeah, that last line really got to me. So I interpreted this as Superman killed himself because he did something he swore never to do. Kill. And I'm sure a lot of you know why this made me cry. My favorite thing at that point in my life died. I remember I started to cry when I was in the car with my mom. We were like going somewhere. I couldn't believe it. But I guess Superman didn't die and lived his life as someone else who married Lois Lane, and together they gave Superman's power to their child, I guess. It doesn't really matter because the story was retconned later down the line, and here I am getting into this DC lore that I said I wouldn't. Point is, I thought Superman died, so it made me sad. This is the latest moment on the list, but it was still almost 10 years ago, which is crazy to think about. Scrubs was one of my favorite comedy TV shows growing up, but it would deal with some pretty heavy themes, both for drama and comedy. Yeah, it can get pretty awkward sometimes. But the heavy themes regarding death should be obvious, seeing as it takes place in a freaking hospital. There were a couple characters that died over the show's run, but the one that hit me the most was George Valentine's death in the episode My Last Words. In this episode, JD and Turk cancel their annual most romantic night ever, their words not mine, at a steakhouse so they can talk to George. I'm just going to sum it up. JD and Turk talk to George about death. That's really all I want to say because I encourage all of you to watch this episode for yourself. I'd also recommend this show, but if you don't want to watch 8 seasons worth, then just check this one out. This episode really got me thinking about death at a young age. Sure, I wasn't like 6, but I was still pretty young. I still remember just sitting in my bed that night thinking about death and how it will eventually happen to us all. I remember wondering if anybody will remember me when I'm gone and if I left a great impact on someone's life. I remember thinking about my great-grandfather and how there's a possibility that he could just die tomorrow. For the record, he's 97 years old now. That's crazy to think about. But I also thought about the moral, I guess, that this episode taught. This was obviously a lot of heavy stuff for me when I was that young, so I went upstairs to talk to my parents about it. I still remember they were sitting on the front porch watching a storm pass by. I won't go into any more details since I've made the mood pretty depressing. Just go check this episode out if you have like 20 minutes to spare. The comedy isn't for everyone, but this episode is worth it. This is really going to show my age. Yes, I started with the Star Wars prequels. They were coming out when I was growing up, and my family didn't have the original trilogy until after all the prequels came out. So I'm sorry that I saw the movies in the incorrect way or whatever. There's nothing I could have really done about it. Anyways, my mom got Star Wars Episode 1 and 2 on DVD a little after the second one came out, and she decided to watch them with me and my brother. I'm pretty sure my dad was there too, but I don't think he was really paying attention because he doesn't care about Star Wars. So I was enjoying it, up until the fight scene between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul. Now, while I'm not a big fan of the first 2 Star Wars movies, I actually like the third one, I will, and I'm sure many of you will agree that the fight scenes are pretty awesome. Way better than how they were in the original trilogy. But I guess the original trilogy had more emotion in the fights, but I'm not gonna go into that. So what made me sad was Qui-Gon's death. Even though it's something that I'm sure a lot of people expected, even something I kind of expected at a young age, like, I had a feeling he would die when Obi-Wan was locked out, but I wasn't prepared for it, and I actually really liked Qui-Gon. I don't really care for him now, because he's so ungodly boring, but I liked him when I was a kid, and witnessing him get stabbed really did make me sad. When I was younger, I was only allowed to watch a couple PG-13 movies. Yeah, I was the kid with the strict parents. One of those movies was Spider-Man 1. In hindsight, I don't really know why I wasn't allowed to watch the second one, even though I had Spider-Man 2 on the GameCube, but whatever. I watched this movie all the time because I loved Spider-Man as a kid. In fact, one of my most nostalgic video games is Spider-Man for the PS1. But in regards to the movie, the part that always got me was Uncle Ben's death. Yes, I know that I'm talking about another death, but death just really got to me as a child. And Uncle Ben always seemed like such a happy and sweet old man, and to see him dying really made me sad. And whoever was the actor for Uncle Ben did a good job in, well, making me cry. What I feel elevated the heartbreak was that it was shown that Peter and Ben didn't have the greatest last encounter. So seeing Peter crying next to his uncle after that argument really broke my heart. Now it's time for the spot that goes to a Disney moment. For a company that is often associated with happiness, there are a ton of depressing moments that come from these movies. There are a lot of Disney moments that could have made the list, but there was one choice that was incredibly obvious for me. Mufasa's death from The Lion King. Yeah, this one is probably on a lot of other people's countdowns, so much so that it's practically a cliche to put this one on a countdown. But this is my list of things that made me cry, so of course I'm not going to exclude it. Story time. So I saw this movie about 500 billion times as a kid, but for some reason Mufasa's death didn't kick in until my 500th viewing maybe. I always thought it was sad, but it didn't make me cry until I really put some thought into it. You see Mufasa lying dead on the ground, and you see Simba witness it. You see a child see their father die. That is just incredibly heartbreaking, and it overwhelmed me with emotion, so much so that I ran to tell my mom. She was laughing and saying, "You've seen that movie like 500 times. I knew that I did, but it just didn't hit me until later." And in my opinion, this is one of the best death scenes in cinema history. Probably not that high, but it is in terms of animation history. The emotions. Knowing how close Simba and Mufasa were. The amazing music, seriously, the background music for this entire scene is incredible. Knowing how much this affects Simba. This scene is still amazing all these years later. I also find it crazy that you see the dead body. That's incredibly depressing, so no wonder it broke so many people's hearts.